Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacinta Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our event tonight as we hear from George Megalogenis as he discusses his very richly insightful essay, Minority Report, The New Shape of Australian Politics. George, it's wonderful to have you back at the Hawke Centre. Thank you, along with Tory Shepherd. So a warm welcome to you both. We're also very pleased to see so many of you here tonight, and I would especially like to welcome our council members and the enterprise leadership team from the University of South Australia. The session tonight is being recorded and will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week. So I encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends, colleagues, neighbours, people down the road who could not be with us tonight, because this is going to be a fantastic conversation. We are also live streaming this presentation, and I welcome our over 300 people, hello everyone, who are joining us tonight. As we are filming, can I please ask that you switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions? So George is an author and journalist with 3 decades experience in the media. The Australian Moment won the 2013 Prime Minister's Literary Award for non-fiction and the 2012 Walkley Award for non-fiction, and formed the basis for the ABC documentary series Making Australia Great. Tonight, George will be in conversation with journalist Tory Shepherd. So without further ado, as they finish their conversation, George and Tory, are you ready? Please welcome.
Hi everyone, it's fantastic to see so many faces here. Great to be here with you, George. And apologies for my momentary lack of attention. George was just whispering to me that Jacinta knocked 10 years off his age. He had 40 years in the press gallery.
In the media.
Yeah, sorry, in the media.
Under 40.
Which is what I was paying attention to. So I thought it was kind of serendipitous that we have you here today on the last sitting day of Federal Parliament. There's been lots going on. I was thinking I'd catch you all up on everything that happened today, but it's still unfolding. But I did want to just read you 3 of the top headlines from The Guardian today. Albanese government plan to raise tax on super balances over 3 million, all but abandoned. Albanese kills off deal with Greens to pass nature-positive legislation. And Hanson alleging payment in breach of Section 44 ends with Thorpe giving the finger. Just thought that was a nice overview of what's happening in Parliament at the moment. And then I thought I'd take you to an audience question first. And the first question we had from the audience, which they said was meant jokingly, was, is it time for a revolution?
Count me out in was that line in the Beatles song. You can count me out in. We sort of had the revolution at the last federal election. Just sort of wind you back, not so much to the detail of the election, but the politics that we had up until that point was a duopoly that was steadily losing market share. Now, what we mean by duopoly, obviously, is, especially since the end of the Second World War, with the formation of the modern Liberal Party, which Robert Menzies led at its inception, you've had a 2-party system where, through the 50s and 60s, around 90% of the combined primary vote belonged to the 2 major parties, and when there was a change of government, there'd be about a 5 percentage point swing in the primary vote from one side to the other, and the incoming government had 50% of the primary vote. And then the Australian Electoral Commission actually acknowledged this point a while ago when they counted back the two-party preferred vote. They didn't even worry about the two-party preferred vote at a national level because the contest was between the two sides. Now, duopolies are a very Australian thing. Obviously, we're in Adelaide, we were below the Barassi line, so we're in one half of duopoly in terms of our culture. We've got 2 footy codes, two major supermarket chains, 2 globally significant mining companies.
The Noah's Ark of democracy.
Well put. The thing about the last federal election, because of the arrival of the teals and the increasing number of Greens, there were 3 of them elected at once in Brisbane of all places, which you think is a more conservative outpost in Australia. The arrival of that much larger crossbench, and for South Australians, of course, you're familiar with independence, and you're familiar with independence at state and federal level, but the arrival of such a big crossbench changed the numbers game in politics almost permanently. And the idea that when you get a change of government, you get a handover in a sense of authority with the incoming government sitting on a reasonable majority, which acts as a buffer for the second term, because they get a swing against them, but they've got a few seats they can afford to lose. That didn't happen at the last election. The last election, the coalition lost in a landslide. Now, by landslide, how do you measure that? Well, their seat count at the end of the election was their lowest share of the parliament on record for the modern Liberal Party. That was one part of it. The other part of it was, for the first time for the modern Liberal Party, they were outnumbered by National Party MPs and the LNP in Queensland in the lower house. So an epic eviction of one part of the duopoly, especially an epic eviction in Melbourne, Sydney and Perth, and to a lesser extent in Brisbane. So that looks like a revolution on paper, but of course the incoming government seized the capital, but they arrived with no guns. So they...
Not that anyone's promoting that kind of activity
well,
in
no,
this country.
John Howard thinks, oh, well, I told you so. We're going to change a government and Labor have no shots to fire on arrival. The Labor Party, remember, just got a 2-seat majority with a primary vote of just under 33%.
Remember they always used to say you can't win unless there's a 4 in front of it?
Right. Well, there was 3 in front of everyone at the last election, and that was the point. So there's been a net swing to minor parties and independents in each federal election since 2007. So 210, 213, 216, 219 and 222 is really the tipping point where the none of the above vote crosses 30%. So the question about the revolution, we've had it. It was televised, for those of you who remember that song as well.
It was live streamed.
It was definitely televised and nothing happened. The Parliament itself seemed to revert to another form of duopoly, which is, without getting too deep into the weeds about the Albanese versus Dutton contest, do you notice how quickly the microphone went back to the opposition leader, even though the opposition leader had fewer seats than any Liberal leader in history in the Parliament? The microphone went straight back to the opposition leader. The crossbench in the lower house was counted out of most legislative equations because Labor had a majority, which was increased by 1. It's the Aston by-election. The Senate looked completely different to the rest of the country anyway, because it was scrambled even before 5 of them changed parties. By the way, count 5 senators since the last election have changed the party they were elected.
It's been very dynamic.
Dynamic is a good word for it. Is it time for a revolution? As I said, we've had one, but the interesting thing for me is how inert the joint has been since the revolution. And part of that is the absence of a majority that Labor feels confident to be able to govern off. And the other part of it is that the Parliament itself hasn't quite registered what the electorate told them at the last election. The 2 parts of the same story. The electorate administered a historic shock on the federal Parliament at the last election by breaking the 2-party system. So when you ask, haven't asked this question yet, but is the duopoly dead? Officially it is.
Do you want me to write that? Do you want me to ask you that?
Is the duopoly dead?
Sorry, George, is the duopoly dead?
Okay, ask yourself this question. Do you expect a net swing to the major parties at the next federal election? Based on the way they performed in this term, right? So that none of the above vote, other things being equal, is going to rise again, which creates all sorts of consequences for our system going forward. You may get a situation a term or two from now where one of the major parties gets a fallback in front of their primary vote and they have an epic win, and the other side has got a 2 in front of their primary vote, but you've still got more than a third of the people voting none of the above. So it's a long way of saying that we've had a revolution, but nothing happened yet.
So is that a good thing? Because my reading was that you went from sort of thinking a hung parliament particularly is not a good thing, a majority would be better, to actually thinking maybe this diversity that we've got in the crossbench might not be the terrible thing that everybody thinks. So is that right? And also, is that because we used to think of the crossbench as kind of the La Cantina scene from Star Wars was the classic analogy.
Hostage takers.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas now it's, I would say, a more thoughtful, considered, centrist mob.
So the thing I'm still toying with in my head is what would a good hung parliament look like and what would a terrible hung parliament look like, and then weigh the risks. And a lot of it's based on personality, and then weigh the risks of what it would mean for the country. When the electorate sees it, how would the electorate respond to it? So the last election, even though we elect a narrow majority Labor government, we do something, and we do have a very simple comparison, and most people will look to opinion polls and read them the way they want to read them, but we've had back-to-back an Australian election in 2022 where a long-term coalition government with multiple prime ministers suffers an epic loss, and the Labor Party win the election with a primary vote of under 33%. We just had the same thing repeated in the UK. Conservative government with probably 1 or 2 more prime ministers than we had because they end up breaking our record. They suffer an epic loss. The Labor Party, although in their case, because they've got a first-past-the-post system and voluntary voting, their primary vote of around 33% translates to a landslide. But of course, a couple of months after they win, people have been showing you polls that Keir Starmer's approval rating is alongside Nigel Farage's in the toilet. So he didn't even have a honeymoon, and down it went. We won't get too deep into the British story, but the fact that the two systems have done a not dissimilar thing in turfing out a Conservative government, but in a post-duopoly setup where the Labor Party comes in with a third of the primary vote. So in the UK, of course, you get a majority government. In Australia, we get a narrow majority for the Labor Party. In the UK, what happened to the Conservative vote is the thing that interests me, because obviously when you chuck out a government, what do you want your parliament to look like after you've chucked out your government? Well, some of that Conservative vote clearly went to the Labor Party because the Labor Party picked up a lot of seats off the Tories. But a lot of that Conservative vote in the UK went to the right. It went to the right of the Conservative Party, and Nigel Farage himself actually got into the House of Commons. So he calls his party now Reform, I think it is. It used to be UKIP, now it's called Reform. Reform is kind of like a word, if you used it here, it'd be like, oh, I wish we could have some. But,
it's meant to be an inherently good thing, right?
Yeah. It's a bit like Liberal in Australia, right? You take Liberal into the US marketplace and they go, you're telling me you're Conservative? You're calling yourself a Liberal? Anyway, be that as it may. So using the UK example and in a sense counting back to the last federal election, Clive Palmer spends over $100 million at the last election. So Clive Palmer spends the equivalent on per capita basis of what Elon Musk and co have done for Trump at the
Is it the same per capita? Fascinating. Yeah.
His 100 million on their to our system is essentially just quantum, because they're billion-dollar enterprises now. By the way, the Americans are stuck with their two-party system because there isn't a cap on financial. They don't even have a disclosure regime, but basically the sky's the limit in terms of the funding of politics. So the barrier to entry for a third force in their system is impossibly high because it's money. Anyway, Clive Palmer, long story short, Clive Palmer gets to test this thesis. Did the Australian people smash the system at the last election in the way the Brits have obviously just smashed their system now twice, through Brexit and by destroying the Conservative Party and then going further to right? Well, we know that isn't what happened. Poor old Clive didn't get Craig Kelly to become Prime Minister. He got a single senator in Victoria, and that seems to be unusual in itself, but there was a bit of an anti-vax sort of lockdown fatigue story happening in the outer suburbs in Melbourne, and that's where he got up. The Liberal vote collapses at the last federal election. The National Party vote, by the way, held up. Liberal Party collapses at the last election, but it didn't go to Palmer. Some of it did, in the crisscross. It didn't go substantially to Palmer. It went back to the centre, and this is really where the teals came. Now, in fact, when I think about SA's political history and the Liberal movement in Steele Hall, you've almost predicted 50 years out what it looks like at a national level if a Conservative Party gets too far off centre, too far off centre-right, too far to the right. You get smashed in the capitals, which is what happened at the last election. So the Australian electorate in 2022, but it's an open question how they'll react if they actually get a hung parliament. The Australian election in 2022 was trying to force change on the system. And it's looking at both main parties and say, look, I don't care which one of you in the long run governs, but you should be listening to Allegra Spender rather than to Clive Palmer. The next Tory government in the UK, if they're going to have one, they probably will have one. The Labor Party looks like it's trying to blow its brains out in its first 6 months in Britain. That party is going to have come to some agreement with the party to their right. See, John Howard didn't even have this problem with Hanson, which was 20-something years ago a completely different electoral demography. Now it's almost impossible to conceive of a situation where there'll be all these independents turning up to the hard right, forcing the next coalition government to go completely native in terms of their. The people of Australia are trying to steer the Libs back to the centre, but the people of Australia also, for the Labor Party, are trying to radicalise them. They're trying to get them to govern. They're trying to get them to do things with power. And that's quite an interesting equation to get from your population. Intuitively, it's a very, very good read. Labor are too timid, Coalition are a little too wacky. And so we'll send you as many crossbenchers as we possibly can to drag you both back to a problem-solving centre. So scenarios for hung parliament, the best one, the dream one, is, and it doesn't matter who's in power, the dream one is that the teals and regional independents between them have enough numbers collectively to be able to force who's ever in power to go to them each time to do big things. And then once it's passed the lower house, to pretty much create moral pressure on the Senate to figure out a way to get it through, even if the numbers in the Senate don't reflect the numbers in the lower house, i.e. that the crossbench in the Senate is a completely different configuration of crossbench in the lower house. That's your dream scenario. And it becomes a dream scenario in two ways, and I'm trying to be super optimistic here. The microphone does not belong to the opposition leader at that point, because the person who's got minority government plus the crossbenchers are the people that you're going to be interested in. And you've got to be interested in one thing and one thing only. Did they get anything done today? Not what the other side is saying, you're all hopeless, nothing's happening, vote for me and I won't tell you how I'm going to pay for it. That style of politics ideally won't necessarily disappear, but your incentives in media and your incentives in lobbying and your incentives in just all the discussions that are had around politics are the minority government plus the crossbench.
The maths, the eternal maths.
Now the scenario at the other end, which is informed by what we've already seen in the Senate, is that there are a whole lot of ego trippers and narcissists and people with legitimate gripes and people for whatever reasons, health reasons or whatever, leave early and there's a by-election, that the numbers on the floor become so unmanageable, and you get two things going on at once for the governing party, i.e. the minority party. They're terrified about the person at the extreme end of their party room, and they're also terrified of not just people crossing the floor, but the silent, changing sides, or going independent or going rogue. That's the sort of scenario in between it, where they just forget to turn up for a particular vote. Or they do a Bridget Archer, which she's just done, and just cross the floor. So you don't even need to set yourself up in an independent or crossbench at that point, because each individual on the backbench knows that their numbers can completely turn the system on its head to your advantage. And of course, some constituents would say, hooray. But I think voters would say, no, this isn't what I bargained for. I don't think Australians will go to the next election wanting a hung parliament, but the way the system seems set up at the moment and the way each of the major parties have reacted to the story of 2022 is we're more likely not to get one. I'm not making this a prediction, by the way, but the thinking is around what the next one will look like. And the next one is going to be probably more interesting than the last one, because the last one had a very, very narrow cast crossbench. There were 5 guys, 4 of them propped up the Gillard government, and Tony Abbott just went no, all the way through it. As I say, I think that's...
They did get a surprising amount through, though, didn't they?
They got a lot through, but they got a lot through for reasons that a lot of us even have to remind myself. Gillard signed essentially a coalition agreement. It wasn't really a coalition agreement, and the Greens had the balance of power in their own right in the Senate. But that gave the Greens an inordinate amount of power to get their agenda through off the back of the Labor agenda. So price on carbon, even though it had been ruled out before the election, becomes national policy. Malaysian people swap? No. Not our agenda, can't be your agenda. And remember, when you think about the Australian Democrats here, obviously big cluster of votes for Australian Democrats here. Janine Haynes and obviously Natasha Doss-Boy, both South Australians who led the Democrats at one point. They were conceived in the Don Chip days as a party to hold a government to account and to keep the system honest, to keep the bastards honest. So it wasn't our platform says X, Y and Z, their platform says something else, and when we go to negotiate, we rule out what they've been elected for and we'll just impose our agenda. That's essentially the way the Greens operate. The Democrats were all about improving government legislation and stopping things that the government hadn't promised. So the blocking power came if you were doing something that you hadn't told the people about. That's not the scenario we'd be looking at in a crossbench, whatever your configuration of crossbench. At the moment, I think because both sides are essentially delegitimised by the 3 in front of their primary votes, and Labor Party at the moment has got a 2 in front of theirs on some polls. And Gillard was at that point, remember, in the middle of the minority government, was one of the reasons why they rolled her in the end.
Was that when we saw the real Julia? Was
the
that
real
that
Julia?
point?
No, she came out the second week of the election campaign.
God, was that early?
She still had a 3 in front of her primary vote in the election campaign, but she was going to lose it at that point.
I don't know how you keep all this stuff in your head. And I want to come back to the Greens.
Sorry, yeah. So, but just on that, so think about this. We'll go back to the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is because the 2 major parties got a 3 in front of it, and we don't have a habit of minority government. This is in Europe, obviously, where it's routine. So the crossbench is going to feel like they have a separate mandate. A mandate in a sense that works above the government that gets elected. And that to me is problematic. And I'm not sure that the electorate is ready for that part of the scenario. Whilst we can think about how wonderful it is that we break a duopoly, it'd be good to see Coles and Woolies held to account, but at some point, if the next shop that opens...
Are we fans of Aldi though, really?
Exactly.
I do want to come back to the Greens, but first of all I wanted to ask you, because I think one of the things that you've done wonderfully in this essay is a sort of a bird's eye view and a historical view, but then also a bit of a subterranean look at some of the strategy behind what happens. What do you think about the more extreme elements within the coalition? Do you think they keep some of them there? I'm thinking of your Alex Antics and people like that as a pressure valve to kind of keep those people in, because then it seems that that strategy then removes the possibility of people like Allegra Spender running for the Liberals. So,
yeah, so you'd need to understand that Liberal Party is still a bit more of a state divisions and a national leader operation in terms of their structure. They're not as sort of organised as Labor is historically, and up until recently, they were never very comfortable in opposition because they're a very leader-based party, and as soon as they lose an election, that leader then ends up voting for somebody else at the next election. Even when after Menzies retired, he didn't give his first preference to John Gorton's Liberal Party in the '69 election, I've been told by someone who was there, weirdly. Gorton then goes independent. Fraser, of course, Where did Malcolm end up? He ended up with the Greens, I think. Did he end up with the Greens, or he was going to form his own political party? But you know, they had that history. Since the Hanson shock, there's been this fear in the Liberal Party that there's another Pauline in the party room who will be more efficient than Pauline was at A, getting a movement around it, but B, then getting seats, i.e. the UKIP reform scenario, the Farage scenario. And so that's one reason why they try and keep him in the tent. But the other reason they keep him in the tent, and this goes more to survival instinct, I think their survival instinct has been dulled a bit by their ability to squeeze out a couple of election results, 2016 and 2019, which basically turned on supermajorities in Queensland and WA. And the Labor Party, and this is an unusual thing when you think about it, the Labor Party is led by Bill Shorten in those two elections, who's a Melburnian, who feels like a Melburnian and also a union official. And the Liberal Party are led by first Malcolm Turnbull and then Scott Morrison in those two elections. And Shorten's Labor Party win a majority of seats in Sydney both times. But because the coalition has won those two elections, it hasn't logged the existential threat that's looming in the cities for them, which is essentially Allegra Spender, Zali Steggall, and by the time you get to Brisbane, a couple of junior woodchucks who are very good at organising on the ground. So they keep them in the tent because the fear of losing the right flank, but you're right, they haven't been keeping an eye on what it is.
Because they've made the tent a more unpleasant place, so now the other people don't want to be in the tent.
So they've assumed that the electorate sort of understands the pragmatic reasons why you keep them in the tent, whereas the electorate are looking at them and thinking, well, you guys are way to the right of me, and you're way to the right of any previous Liberal government I've voted for. And remember, those teals turn up at once, and suddenly all those seats fell at once, which is not your traditional experience of independence. 7 moved if you count the one that went against Labor, which is Fowler, to Daly. But 6 went, and in fact, if they'd been more organised, they would have picked off a couple in Brisbane as well, because they didn't stand any candidates in Brisbane. And if they had a decent candidate in Higgins, they would have got one of them as well. They could have got up to 10. And we know Sturt could have fallen. And it's possible that another couple will turn up at the next federal election. So that was a long time coming, but it happens all at once because at that last federal election, Scott Morrison thinks, I've got one more supermajority in Queensland that I could use to squeeze out one more narrow victory. They used to talk about goat track, remember?
Yeah.
On the coalition side.
Yeah, you had Andrew Hurst, the kind of strategy guy, sitting in a room just plotting, if we get that Tasmanian seat here and if we get this one here, it's very micro.
But obviously the country intuitively has never looked like that party room. But now after that last election, that party room, as I mentioned earlier, the Liberal Party of Robert Menzies, the urban middle class based Liberal Party that built bridge between the leafy suburbs and rural and regional Australia, that party, which is a conception of Menzies at a time when only Adelaide, Perth and Melbourne have a majority of the population of their respective states. So this is a city-country party, that the Liberals themselves are a city-country party with the country party as their coalition partner. They're now the majority they're now the minority, in the party room. The LNP, which is Dutton's party, where the supermajority is in charge. And the party formerly led by Barnaby Joyce has another 10 seats in the lower house and they didn't lose one at the last election. So when you're asking about some of the people on the fringes, they're actually a lot closer to what the party room looks like now than it looks like to us looking from the outside. So it's harder to recognise them as a threat when you're kind of a bit like them, but maybe not as crazy. So I think that's...
Is it Barnaby Joyce we're talking about here?
Not necessarily Barnaby. It's a composition issue. It's a composition issue. If your party room isn't diverse enough, and by the way, if you're looking at a party room now that has decided to write off the teal seats, so their strategy is to forget the teal seats, because we had a little experiment with the Voice to see whether those teal seats would just revert once to sort of what Dutton was asking, which is to vote no, and they all voted yes. All of them. So, and then he saw that and he thought, well, I got a no there, but I got I got a yes there, but I got a lot of no's in Labor seats. So I'll be looking at the Labor seats. So again, that comes back to, so why would you keep them all in the tent? Maybe that is their tent. Maybe that's who they've become, and it's and inside that tent, you've decided to write off the capital cities, and you think there are more seats like yours, which you already hold, there for the taking. And after the last election, Arthur Sinodinos, remember, he was John Howard's Chief of Staff, subsequently an ambassador to Washington, and Jane Hume, who's a senator from Victoria, were tasked with the post-election review. And a couple of zingers in that review. One was aimed at Dutton about the role he played in alienating conservative Chinese Australians and turning them into Labor voters. There was a very, very pointed reference to that in there, which he's logged and he understands. But the other one was, you cannot write off inner metropolitan Australia because there simply aren't enough seats to win majority government from the regions. So it's in black and white in terms of their post-election review. But inside that party room, which is now where the urban-based MPs are in the minority, they're essentially asking people in that party room to prioritise seats like theirs, which would then change the composition of that party room. It's a power trip, right? It will then change that composition of the party room, even if it comes with government. It comes with government, but your faction is not going to get to enjoy government. So I've seen this movie once before, and that was the Labor Party, especially in Victoria, when they decided it was better to be pure and as Trotskyist as they possibly could be in Victoria in the 50s and 60s after the split. And they were quite happy to lose elections because they thought the day that they won with their very, very radicalised government, which would involve a very radicalised government, they got to change the state in their own name, as if the rest of the state would sort of cop it. They just never got the chance because people kept saying no to them. And I wonder whether that possibility exists for the coalition, regardless of what happens at the next election, that at some point there'll have to be a penny drop about the almost implausibility mathematically of trying to govern Australia from Barnaby Joyce's electorate, for example.
Yeah. Do you have, you mentioned the Voice and Peter Dutton looking at the no's, and obviously things changed very quickly when it came to the referendum, and I think people also, there's sort of sense that, well, the gay marriage vote went this way, so we're bending more progressive, so there should be, you know, a bit of complacency snuck in. How do you track that, I guess, from the gay marriage to the referendum? Is it the individual context of those votes, or is something happening in terms of the way the country's swinging?
Yeah, I think the marriage equality debate's an interesting one because remember it's a postal vote, so it's technically a plebiscite, but the conscription referenda, which we refer to as referenda, they were plebiscites as well. So it's voluntary, not compulsory. Now, a voluntary vote, if a voluntary vote had been held in '99, the exit polling suggests that the ANU ran some exit polling at the time, that the Republic would have got up. That a lot of no's just wouldn't have turned up. The don't cares wouldn't have turned up, and that the Republic would have got up, which is a very interesting thought experiment to run if it had just been a plebiscite, but obviously it had to be a referendum. I've gone back to 99, then looked at 2017, and then overlaid 2023. So what I've done is basically used each of those referenda as a social X-ray and plonked one on top of the other to see what is changing in Australia in the last 20-something years. Because it's easy to, the headline observation about the end of the duopoly, well, what's beneath that? And rather than do the thing that everybody else was doing, which is sort of have a look at a partial data piece here, interview a couple of people there, let's put 3 actual votes on top of each other and see what part of that story informs the end of the duopoly.
It's really crying out for graphic visualisation, by the way.
It is, except I've got long arms, so I will try, especially for those watching on the live stream. I'll try and give you a sense of what it was telling us. So can I start, because I know you've asked me about marriage equality, can I start in 99?
Yeah, take it back, go.
So 99 is interesting when you do it by electorate. The national vote's obviously 55-45 for the status quo. The exit polls at the time told us that the majority of the no vote, i.e. bit over 30 percentage points of that 55 are actually Republicans who prefer a direct election. And so Republicans outnumbered monarchists in the no camp. And obviously John Howard would think he's a genius for having split the yes vote, which he did. But there was still a story to be told about the location of the yes vote and how it related to the no vote across the country. And other things being equal, the further you got away from the CBD in each capital city, the lower the yes vote and the higher the no vote. The highest yes vote is in the electorate of Melbourne, and the lowest yes vote in 99 is Maranoa, which is now David Littleproud's seat, which is outback Queensland. Now that polarity between inner city Melbourne and outback Queensland repeats during the voice. So they're the two highest and lowest. There's a good top line observation to make, but there's a swing from yes to no. So the yes vote during the referendum in outback Queensland is in the low 20s or 30s, and it's only 15% for the voice. So there's like a swing away. It's less progressive, if that makes sense. If we use the two, I'll get to marriage equality in a sec. So at the top and the bottom of the distribution for yes and no, there's a swing away. There's a swing to no the further you get out compared to 99. Now in Maranoa, there's actually a good historical reason to think long and hard about why that's always been the no centre in Australia, the most conservative part of Australia. It's the site, unfortunately, of two of the biggest documented Aboriginal massacres. And it's also, weirdly, from the Labor perspective, one of the contested birthplaces for the Labor movement at Barcaldine. So that electorate contains both those stories. So the Labor movement, which we know going into Federation is blue collar but white Australia, and also there's a lot of tears were shed, a lot of blood was shed in that area too. So relationship, that area's relationship with the rest of Australia and the question of who we are as Australians. When you think about inner city Melbourne, what is inner city Melbourne? Inner city Melbourne is the entry port to the gold rush of the 1850s, big democratic surge there, and it's also, from the post-war migration program onwards, the most ethnically diverse but cohesive part of Australia as well. So just using that as your sort of top and bottom, when I checked these votes, and it's quite interesting, it struck me that the swing away told me one thing about how regional Australia is feeling less connected to the cities than it ever has. So that's one point of the story. But the other part of the story, and this is where the detail gets really fascinating in the cities themselves, because the cities themselves are changing really quickly. There's a swing to yes the closer you get to the CBD compared to 1999. So even though the voice has tanked in a major way, like there's across the country, there's a 5% shift from the yes vote for the referendum for a republic, 45, to just below 40 for the voice. So if you use 5 as your baseline, there's a net swing of net minus 5 across the country. There's like plus 6 to 10% in Melbourne for the voice, right? So the voice has triggered more cosmopolitan unity than the republic did. But the gap between the top and the bottom, that makes your gap between the top and the bottom widen. Now within the cities, so I said I was going to flag Republic and then we'll get to marriage equality. So within the cities, you had Melbourne as the majority yes city in both referenda, but a number of seats that voted yes in 99 vote no in 2023, even though the inner city is even more progressive than it was 20 odd years ago. All those electorates are increasingly ethnically diverse. So they're safe Labor strongholds in the north, northwest and the south of Melbourne, deep south of Melbourne, deep southeast, and they are more ethnically diverse than they were 25 years ago, but they are very socially conservative. So how do we know this? That's why marriage equality in between those two is the proper signal to look at. And I'll switch from Melbourne to Sydney. Sydney is a majority yes seat in 1999. Strangely though, John Howard puts the referendum and he wants it to fail, but his seat votes yes, as does the rest of the city on average. Paul Keating, who's no longer there, but he's the reason why we're having this referendum. Blaxland votes no against. So I always view this as almost most sublime expression of Australian contrarianness. But Keating gets a no for the Republic in his own seat, and Howard gets a yes, the monarchist. But Sydney is majority but divided. It's majority yes in 99. All of Western Sydney, bar Fowler by the way, all of Western Sydney, which is all safe Labor territory, voted no in 1999. In 2023, Sydney's moved from a majority yes to majority no. And in fact, the yes belt is really, really contained in and around Sydney Harbour. So any electorate with a harbour view or a water view as you go further north, and I'm not kidding, any electorate with a harbour view has voted yes. Every other electorate that does not have a harbour view, every other electorate has voted no.
Not only views recorded in that ABS data somewhere that you can do the breakdown.
We can figure out. Yeah, I know. So if we're both still at News Limited, and I pitched this story to head office, I would say, right, find me the booth where the transition from yes to no is, and they can still see the water. Some poor young cadet would have to be sent out there to point a microphone a couple of random people.
Or the undecided voter who's only got a sliver of a view if you stick your head out the window and see whether they go on and off.
And I've done this by analogy because train journeys are always the best analogy as you go through electorates. So if you start at Central Station and you're heading to Bankstown, so you're basically going through into the deep west of Sydney. So you're heading into Labor territory. You're starting in Labor territory, and you'll remain in Labor territory. But these are two Australias as you go from the inner city of Sydney to the western suburbs. The no vote rises about 10 points at each change of electorate. So the Plibersek and Albanese electorates have got really, really high yes votes. But as soon as you sort of turn west at Marrickville Station, and you're heading into Tony Burke's seat and Jason Clare's seat, the no vote is going dink, dink, dink. Now, why are we flagging marriage equality early? Because you already know the answer to this question, but you're going to make me sound like I've come up with the answer in conversation.
Brilliant,
right?
That's it. It's all just questions without notice, and you were just pulling us all straight out of that magnificent brain.
So 99 to 2023 is a really interesting story. So why is the inner city becoming more progressive, and why are the outer suburbs becoming less progressive? Well, what's driving the population in those two parts of the capitals are two different things. One's internal migration, which is a gentrification of the inner city. There's a whole lot of yuppies moved back in. And not just yuppies, by the way, second, third generation kids with migrant parents or grandparents, going back to the old working class suburbs to pay a couple of $1 million for a place that their parents fled from in the 60s and 70s because they wanted to get out to Doncaster, or they wanted to get out to the Hills district of Sydney or whatever. You know, it's like 2 garages and a garden and a faux Parthenon erected in the front yard, and the Italians would get their water features going, and all the little statues of David, and this is a social phenomenon, right? And Adelaide's probably going to start to see a version of this as well, except the Greeks never left Adelaide, from what I understand. So the inner cities are gentrifying. They're actually becoming wider than they were even 10 years ago. And this is the second fastest growing part of the capitals. The fastest growing part are the outer suburbs, and the outer suburbs are dominated by migrants and their kids. Mm-hmm. And let's go back to Sydney's West, because Sydney's West is where it gets really, really intriguing. So Parramatta at the moment, any ABC people in the room? So, the ABC is sort of now projecting onto Parramatta the real Sydney, and they're trying to send a whole lot of people up there.
It's caused some angst.
It's caused some angst, but across the media, so Tory and I got old News Limited pedigree, and we all know
Mine's not quite as old as yours.
Yeah, yes. I know, but we've all got I know, I'm on my seniors tour, right? So
he's literally on his seniors tour, he's calling it.
I'm calling it the seniors tour, right, because I don't play open grade anymore. My first book was published 21 years ago, so I think this qualifies as a seniors tour. Our head office, Holt Street, in Sydney and Surrey Hills, a couple of minutes by foot to Central Station. Ultimo at the ABC, a couple of minutes by foot to Central Station, and the old Fairfax on Broadway, a couple of minutes by foot to Central Station. The least representative but most powerful 3 media organisations in the country all live within a kilometre of each other, and they think that real Sydney is the train line a 20-minute train ride to the Qantas lounge. It's occurred to each of them as their market share has diminished that most of the growth in Sydney is out in the west, where real Sydney is. So now they just think, right, let's go over there and see what these blue-collar battler rugby league supporters are all thinking out there. And they turn up there and they find, to their shock, two things. One, it's not like they imagined it, obviously, because it's not as wide as they imagined it would be, because they thought this is Alan Jones territory, struggle town. It's not. In Parramatta, and I use Parramatta as a bit of an example, across Sydney, 2/3, so 67% of Sydney's population across the entire city is either a migrant or has at least one migrant parent. So born overseas or with one migrant parent, first and second generation, adds up to 67% of the population. Adelaide's, by the way, is just over 51%. It's around 50-51%. So that's just to give you an idea of what Sydney as a whole looks like. In Parramatta, it's 90%. And the entirety of their population growth is coming from the migration program. And in fact, Sydney is radically changing its ethnic face because their property market is spitting out a whole lot of... They lose about 20,000 people a year from Sydney in net terms to interstate migration. And they tend on average to be whiter than the city at large. So the city gets more diverse because their old Australian population is shrinking in absolute terms. It happens in country towns for different reasons because of ageing, but in Sydney it's happening because people are getting priced out. But by the way, 5-10 years later, migrant communities start to exit Sydney at the same rate as the local born do, because property being what it is. But in the West, led by Indian migration, because that's the dominant wave of the 21st century. The second part of that wave for Sydney, obviously, Chinese migration. When we looked at the 2017 plebiscite, and this is even before you go to the sort of their anchor diversity in Western Sydney, which is Middle Eastern, Arab and Muslim populations from the 70s and 80s intakes, and Vietnamese as well. So when you look at the marriage equality debate, do you remember the vote was just under 62% yes? Every state votes yes. Only a dozen or so electorates vote no out of 151. And something like 9 or 10 of those dozen electorates are in the one spot, Western Sydney. So it's less of a surprise that Western Sydney delivers its third no vote. But what's more interesting about the consequence of the no vote for the Voice is that the no campaign late in the piece started to hit hard the disinformation campaign in non-English speaking communities and got a payoff that I think, and they will never own up to it, but it got a payoff that they probably didn't expect. The tracking polls, and there are more polls than you ever needed to look at for the Voice, the tracking polls, when the national vote tipped below 50, there were really only three groups that were still voting yes at that point. It was younger Australians with a tertiary degree, Aboriginal and Torres, and younger Australians obviously living in the inner city, and we know those electorates ended up voting yes. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, of course, that they had the highest yes vote of any cohort in Australia, and non-English speaking, and voters where a language other than English was spoken at home. The final quarter, when the game was already lost, the final quarter, the New Australian Vote for the Voice collapses when the disinformation campaign runs, and it collapses in quite a dramatic way, and it's the reason why the national vote got dragged below 40%. For Peter Dutton, who thinks there's a path to power that ignores the teals seats, which all voted yes for the Voice, he's actually been shown through the Voice referendum and previously the marriage equality plebiscite that the cities themselves, whilst you tend to view cities as sort of cosmopolitan entities and diverse entities, within that diversity there are very, very socially conservative electorates towards the outer suburbs. So he's looking at them through that lens. He's also trying, he's also trying to play an anti-immigration card at the same time and hope that the migrants accept it. I don't want to flag your next.
Well, that was going to be my...
Yeah, it's going to be
I did want to go into that,
yeah.
Because it does look like Peter Dutton is setting up to have immigration as a pretty large part heading into the election. There is a bit of a death spiral there with Labor at times. And you would think, and perhaps this is facile, that with such large proportions of migrants and second generations and third, that wouldn't fly. But that's not quite true, is it? Like
No, it's not quite true.
The migrants might be a bit against migration.
I think they might be. I think it's possible to convince them to be against not necessarily their own tribe, but the idea that they got here when the country was still working, they got here the right way, but this mad Labor government has just taken the lid off it, and then too many are coming at once. So that's you can play that card to pretty much any Australian, and they'll go, oh yeah, I see some sense in that. There's a detail to the migration debate which Peter Dutton would be aware of, but of course he doesn't need to acknowledge it, because why spoil a good scare campaign? The decision to take the cap, the hours that students could work, was taken by Morrison. When they reopened the economy after 2022, they were afraid that we were going to have labour shortages when we reopened, and that 500,000 net migration number that you keep hearing bandied about is a consequence of a decision to have uncontrolled migration from the anti-migration party. And of course, to them, we didn't do it because we got kicked out, so how could we have done it? And the Labor Party have inherited this mess and have spent the last couple of years trying to figure out what to do with it. And obviously with the universities, they may have slammed the brake a bit too hard with the cap on international students. And the Coalition, of course, are now literally laughing their heads off, because Labor are trying to correct for pro-migration policies of the Coalition government, which no one in Australia thinks that the Coalition actually are responsible for. And the Coalition is saying, you're not going hard enough, but hang on a minute, we're fixing your mess. It's quite amusing if it wasn't so serious, but it is quite amusing. And obviously once the economy reopens, you've also got an inflation shock. So you don't even need to be brutal about your anti-migration card. You're playing a cost of living card, and your cost of living card is a congestion card, it's a housing shortage card, it's why would you bring in 500,000 people when we've got a cost of living crisis? Well, the answer's a bit more complicated than that. If you stopped at cold dead, which is what the rhetoric suggests, and you get your labour shortages, which constituent gets hurt first by the absence of migrants? It's rural and regional Australia, which is Coalition stronghold. In fact, you would not wish this on your ageing and your poorer communities, that you couldn't service them. You just would not wish this on these communities.
It's also harder to build houses if you're not bringing in some of the construction workers.
Well, if you think about your aged care labour force and your construction labour force, which female and male labour forces, and there's already a shortage of labour supply within the existing population, old Australians, migrants and their kids, right, and Indigenous. There's an existing labour shortage. It doesn't mean that because there's a shortage, it doesn't mean that people say, well, I don't want my nursing home staffed today. I accept that it's very, very difficult now with a cost of living crisis, and I'll just sort of, maybe skip a couple of shifts. No, that's not the way people think. People expect the Australian government to do things for them. And one of the reasons why Australia, not counting that single quarter when we went negative during lockdown, it's one of the reasons why Australia hasn't had a major recession since the early 1990s, is we're running an open market, but with a decent safety net and also a demand-driven migration program. And we still look, when other countries look at us, we still look like the role model. Germans did come here a few years ago for advice on how to run a mass migration program. I'm not making that up because I was involved in some of those conversations with them. This is before they received...
The UK had a look at our deportation program.
Well, sorry, there's always the counterfactual, which is the UK, right? So they think Europe is possibly a going concern, maybe not. Why don't we vote ourselves out of it, make us weaker and them weaker at the same time, and see how that flies?
Genius.
And then we get Trump, who then is going to slap tariffs on all of us just because somebody still hasn't convinced him that a tariff is a cost on your consumer. It's not a tax. It's not a tax on a foreigner making things.
Do you picture all these people sitting? I mean, this incredible group of people he's surrounded himself with. Is Elon Musk going to say, look, in the name of government efficiency, let's not do the tariffs, and then we can use some of that money to cut? What do you think? What do you picture people telling Trump when he comes up with such things that are so contradictory to the evidence?
So there's somebody in that room already that's envious of what Musk sort of jumping the queue in terms of influence, and at some point that person, whether it's the son or one of the others who've been there forever, whisper into Trump's ear, by the way, those electric cars, right? the premise of those electric cars is that climate change is a thing, right? If you give this guy too much power, he's not going to be drill, baby, drill. He's going to be making us all buy a battery.
And the moment of realisation will
Here we go.
strike.
He's a globalist, mate. He's a globalist. Oh, is he? Really? Yeah, he's a globalist, mate. And he won't be paying those tariffs anyway. Anyway, sorry.
Or he'll
we
be
digress.
stuffed by the tariffs because he imports so much from China, and so then he'll turn on Trump. Anything could happen, I think, is the point we're getting to.
Yeah. But just going back to the anti-immigration card. So, before we were doing that, what best case, worst case, hung parliament looked like. Let's do best case, worst case for the migration card for Peter Dutton. And this is an important thought experiment, because at the end of this thought experiment is your sense of where the Australian middle might be, depending on how the card is played. So you're a Queenslander in a state that is still majority old Australian, so migrants and their children are not yet 40% of Queensland, and in Brisbane they're just under half. Gold Coast, by the way, is majority migrant, but that's because Gold Coast is a younger and a smaller city. Brisbane's 2.5 million people are majority old Australian, first, second and third generation. You were born here, as were your parents, as were your grandparents. But obviously in the inner city, gentrification and whiteness doesn't make you a Conservative voter necessarily, because there are 3 Green seats in the inner city of Brisbane. So you're a Queenslander looking at the electoral map that says there are opportunities in these blood-red parts of Sydney and Melbourne where Labor always win, which some of them are ex-manufacturing, some of them are just ethnically diverse, whatever they are, seats that Gough Whitlam and Paul Keating used to hold. All right, we've already lost seats that Malcolm Turnbull and Peter Costello and Josh Frydenberg and John Gorton and Harold Holt and Robert Menzies. We've lost all those seats, right, to the teals. So why don't we go take some safe Labor seats? And you're thinking as a Queenslander, and I've got a hot button issue, can a Queenslander convince somebody in Sydney's West who is either Indian heritage or Vietnamese heritage, no, just a serious question, or Arab heritage, Lebanese say, because these are the actual voters we're talking about that might be able to tip the scale if the lifetime Labor voters then switched, although the Vietnamese tend to be a little more socially conservative, and because Malcolm Fraser brought them out, there's a residual Liberal loyalty within the Vietnamese community. So would you be able to pull it off if you went really hard and you said, right, I'm going hardcore, the sort of thing that will shore up my base in Queensland, and you're going to like this too, right? Which is, you can't bring any other member of your family to study at a university. You certainly can't bring your mum or your grandparent, or you can't bring an aunt who wants to work in a nursing home. He's obviously not that. No politician is that thick, ever. So he's not going to go that hard.
You say no politician.
No politician.
No.
You find me one.
Well, Ralph Babbitt would probably be that stupid.
Would he target the Indian community by telling the Indians that he was not going to let another Indian into Australia and expect their vote? Maybe he might. I don't know. Look, I haven't had this conversation with him. So that's your sort of, the extreme race card is really about making sure that everybody else in Australia knows which group you're picking on, because that's how race cards used to work in the past. But it's a very difficult thing to do in a majority migrant electorate. It's very difficult to do, because what you're really telling people is at some point in the future, your aspiration for your extended family is a problem for me, because I can get elected by denying them entry. But by the way, I'm also asking for your vote. So anyway, so that's the worst case. So his better case scenario is the scenario that what Trump plays at the margin with Hispanic community and even with African Americans, which is you're all here for the right reasons, but the next one isn't. And it's a they. It's not a you, and it's not your family. Mm-hmm. So can he do that? Well, of course, that's what he's thinking about. And he's had the voice to give him an incentive, and he's weirdly, because a lot of politicians on both sides, but especially Conservative politicians, look at America and think that it's immediately transferable to Australia, which it isn't for a number of reasons. But of course, Labor people do the same thing. After Obama wins in 2008, pretty much every second person that was remotely associated with the Obama campaign came down to Australia to advise the Labor Party about how to do it, even though they'd already won an election. And of course, they lost their majority at their next election, so none of that advice seemed to work too well for them at the time. So yeah, there is a bad way and a good way to play this card. So what will be the consequences of him playing it well, and the Labor Party falling into a minority, even finishing second in the dance? So the coalition have more seats than the Labor Party, and the Labor Party have lost heartland seats in the outer suburbs, and they're ethnically diverse electorates. So everybody will be writing the story in the same way, because they'll just sort of look at the top line, which is, migrant electorates move from Labor to either Liberal or what I call a brown, and I do this with love, as olive skin myself, a brown independent, like Mordai Lees. So if that happened at the next election, you'd be saying to the Labor Party, well, first thing you'd say to the Liberal Party is, congratulations, you've played a mass migration and anti-migration card and got a bump in migrant communities. You'd also say to the Labor Party, well, for the last 30 odd years where you're looking at the inner city having your little turf wars with the Greens, which is essentially a white on white, red on green contest between gentrified members of the political class, and out there where real Australia is, where the engine group, small business and the engine room of our sort of better educated cohorts is, and you haven't bothered to look there and ask them what they might want from you, because they've voted for you the last 15 times anyway. It would be look, what would you wish on the country? You'd wish a scare for the major parties that becomes more visceral than just a third, which is that no seat is safe. You would wish that on them. And then the next step, once you've wished that on them, is for them to first go back to their base and not think base means my party room. Base means I may actually have to go out there where I haven't campaigned at all because it's been a safe seat with a 20% margin for as long as I've been in the system. You actually have to go back out there and have a look at it. And also think about the thing, I talk about this a lot, because the change in Australia's population in the last 15 years has made everywhere different all at once. And it's done this because we've hit that tipping point where the boomers are starting to exit the labour market. First, the boomers reached 65 in 2011. We come out of the GFC, we've had a deep recession, and we get huge surge in migration around about the same time. Push and pull factors, but essentially the rest of the world is projecting onto us safe haven status, and we're getting many more migrants than either side of politics, and a lot of them are pretty well educated. Obviously, the tertiary sector has built a revenue model around them. But because this became automatically a normal thing, and both sides agreed to it, because you wouldn't wish a recession on your country, because how do you get a second term with a recession? You've had the thing that hasn't been noticed in the political system, which is that cities themselves are starting to move in completely different directions. So when I talk about the inner city of Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne looking more alike than even the rest of their respective cities. So across that band, this is why the Greens vote sort of taps out about 10 k's out of the CBD in each of those three. But it's a geographically concentrated vote around younger voters, and it's a vote that can get you a seat without you knowing who the leader is of the party. So it's not a personality-based party like a Hanson or a Palmer party. It is an idea of a party which appeals to a certain segment of the Australian electorate, which is concentrating in election winning, in seat deciding numbers at one point. The teals, completely different phenomenon. Suddenly you get people with a life out of politics who are instantly recognisable to their constituents as the sorts of people you would send to Parliament to fix that joint, not to wreck it, but to fix it. But within the diversity in the cities, it's not that one size doesn't fit all now in campaigning purposes. It's because everywhere is different within the cities, and the cities themselves are different to the rest of state, and then each of the capitals are different to one another. And how do you measure this? Up until 2011 census, didn't matter where you looked, the first and the second largest overseas born groups in a capital city or a town tended to be the same. Then it would have been the English with the Kiwis at number 2. In the intervening 10 years was a huge decade of diversity. The Chinese have risen to number 1 in Sydney, the Indians are number 2, The Indians are number one and the Chinese are number two in Melbourne. The Indians are number one in Canberra. English is still number one here, but the Indians are number two. The English is still number one in Perth and in Hobart. Migrants from the Philippines are number one in Darwin, and migrants from New Zealand are number one in Brisbane and on the Gold Coast. So just thinking about the diversity of each of these cities, as a national political party, if you don't empower your local members and you don't get intel on the ground each time, if you don't have a representative party, you bug it anyway, because you will get the sort of shock that Morrison got at the last election. By the way, Morrison's shock, let's get really ethnically specific. They did two things during lockdown which was guaranteed to destroy them in the outer suburbs, which the ones that Dutton are targeting now. One, Peter Dutton himself, as I alluded to earlier, told Australians on Anzac Day just before the 2022 election to prepare for war with China. So the 1.4 million Australians of Chinese ancestry goes, mate, you are a moron.
I think it went out on WeChat pretty quickly.
Yeah. He did work this out very quickly. He's much more pragmatic than Steve. It's still a dumb thing to say. But the dumbest thing that was done in that term of government was that crazy week when the Morrison government panicked and threatened jail for anyone who came to Australia from India during the Delta outbreak. Do you remember that? Just one. It didn't matter who you were and it didn't matter what your circumstances were. And they issued a press release with prison as the warning. And in one of the interviews, somebody said, why are you threatening to lock up Australians wanting to come home where there isn't COVID, where there is COVID from where they're coming? He said, no, there's no penal sanctions, blah, blah, blah. He said, it's in your press release. And then he pretended he hadn't written the press release. The health minister had written it, even though he was also the health minister at the time, which we didn't know at the time. So, yeah. Race card. It's very difficult to be specific with a race card against a minority group on behalf of the rest of the country. You know, asylum seekers. Back in the day when Paul Hanson thought you could be specific about Asians when they were outnumbered by pretty much every other ethnic group. Can't do that now. It's going to be more difficult, especially when you're looking at diversity across each of those capitals. Because I can guarantee you pretty much everyone in Australia, even though we all don't like our identity politics, will log an insult, whether it's women during the Brittany Higgins matter, whether it's Indians during the Delta panic.
As a childless cat lady, I always log the insult.
Yeah. Oh, you wanted to vote for the insult. Yes. So yeah, there is complexity in the electorate, but it's complexity that's happened so quickly. It doesn't just coincide with the breakdown of the duopoly. It's one of the things that explains it, and you can make more sense of the breakdown of the duopoly when you get your head around the idea that everywhere is different, but the parties are still thinking about an electorate where they're only competing for 10 of the 20% that don't vote for them, and that 10% have all got a mortgage.
George, we are running out of time terrifyingly quickly. So I've just done something rash. I've conflated...
Let's ask more questions can we ask more questions from the audience that
yes,
you've already had
what
written
I've
in?
done
Yep.
is I have conflated a bunch of the questions together because I think we only have time for one more. So we got great questions from the audience people. That's why I started off with one. I looked at it and went, oh, it's embarrassing. They're a bit better than the ones I'd written.
They're better than yours.
There does seem to be a theme though. So I'm going to consolidate the questions from the audience with a couple of things that I wanted to ask about. And I might be trying a bit too hard to blend these things here. There's pragmatism and then there's ideology. How does that play out and will that play out in a healthier way in a hung parliament? And does the way that play out, could that restore trust in our parliament? It's a big one, you've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, and it does go back, I'll try and think about, because I grew up on a tabloid, so we're taught to write really, really short paragraphs, and within the first 3 paragraphs there had to be a quote to prove that you talked to somebody. Remember that old rule? Maybe it wasn't. I grew up on the Melbourne Sun. That was our rule. That was our rule at the Sun. When you think about what when does self-interest and ideology coalesce? And it does when your numbers are so small that it will coalesce at the point at which you've chosen the path of least demographic resistance in the short term. So you're Labor and you're only going to the cities and you're forgetting the regions. You're Coalition and you're just going to hold your numbers in the cities and try and pinch a couple in the outer suburbs. You're Green and you're only going to talk to your people. I'll just add the Greens into it. I won't put the Teals into it because the Teals do feel a little more balanced, let's say, than the 3.5 parties we've got at the moment. So when it's not possible to form a majority government, when the penny drops, if it's not next election or the election after, for both those parties, right? When it's not possible to form a majority government, you need to do two things at once. One, you need to engage the crossbench just to form a minority government. But two, you have to start thinking about what it is that isn't connecting in those seats for you. And if the Teals, for example, are telling the coalition to come back to planet normal on climate change, or the Teals are telling the Labor Party to get off your backside and do tax reform, and the Greens, notwithstanding some of the ideology, seems like more performative ideology than practical suggestions for policy, that the housing crisis is a real and present danger to social cohesion, and there's a generational rip-off going on here. Think about the younger voter properly. Like if that's what it takes to restore the major parties to thinking in a policy sense, which will require them to think ideologically, but morally as well, then I'm all for that. But the other part to it is, and there's another part to ideology, and that is when the path of least demographic resistance, and understand what I'm talking about, least demographic resistance, there are still seats for a coalition party room that's wider than the nation at large that will always be white. Now that party can convince itself that the rest of the country looks like them. The same thing can happen to the Labor Party that's sort of headquartered in the cities and a couple of provincial towns. It can convince itself, as the Democrats obviously did in the US at the last presidential election, that the entire country is cosmopolitan and is ready to embrace a new utopian identity. I mean, for me, that's the bigger problem. The bigger problem at the moment is that the two parties are separating along tribal organisations in the first place, but are going to intuitively separate demographically because that's the easiest thing for them to do. Whether the majority actually is in building the bridge for two. The next majority government, and this is where we come back to the sort of the sense of some of these questions. In a way, you're looking at a hung parliament as the halfway house to somebody showing you what a new majority looks like. And then that's ultimately, I think I wouldn't mind seeing the duopoly work properly again and be good competitive duopoly. That's ultimately what you would be looking for. You would be looking for one of them and go, it's not working for me at a third of the population. It's certainly not working for me thinking by place in a city or outer suburbs or regions. It's not working for me. The other thing is I've got now a real problem, which is all the winners of deregulation and all the winners of our mass migration program are concentrated in the cities and they're paying taxes, and all the recipients of welfare are in the regions. And at some point, you don't want to break that social bond between them, because this is a different challenge to a more sort of ethnically predictable Australia where everybody looks the same, even if it's more diverse in some areas than others. This is a more difficult problem for you if you've got huge skill migration program, people land with not necessarily an intention to stay if they can be cherry-picked by another country, Canada, for example, or New Zealand, or, some mythical restoration of a progressive US administration. So you've got the sort of hunt for talent, so you've got that problem, but they're taxpayers as well, so you're going to have to be bidding their taxes down. And at the same time, you've got constituencies that you want them to get along with your taxpayer because you want to be able to fund their services. I think the cohesion equation, people talk about cohesion in different ways. For me, the budget is almost your simplest product that tells you whether you are or aren't running a cohesive Australia, because Australians want a viable safety net. But again, the conversation is going to be changing in and around who's paying taxes and who's receiving them, because if it's predominantly older, whiter Australians and the taxpayers are predominantly younger, better educated, either migrants or gentrified Australians, they're not talking to each other. And they won't be talking to each other in a third political system. So in the long run, I don't want to see a run of hung parliaments, if I've just contradicted my thesis. Again,
no,
what I'm talking
there
about...
is a surprise twist and ending, but you're just going to have to buy the quarterly essay to find out what it is. You haven't heard it all yet, folks, and we barely got through
I'm sorry about the long answers,
Not
but
at all.
they're good stories, I think.
All of that was
Good
fascinating.
stories.
And I've got to say, as I was reading the quarterly essay, I felt stupid because of so many things in there that I hadn't thought about, didn't know in the first place, or had entirely forgotten. But then by the time I'd finished it and absorbed it, I felt a bit smarter. So it's definitely worth the outlay. And we've got some
The
signed...
reader is never wrong. Isn't that right?
Is that a thing they say?
Well, the consumer's never wrong, and the ABC audience is never wrong. Bring back my good friend Sarah McDonald, if anybody's listening on that podcast, because I know the ABC are broadcasting this. So if I'm allowed to keep that in, please keep it in. With no comment passed on management, but she's a gun, and she should be on your team.
Very smoothly done, George Megalogenis. Well done. All right, so thanks everyone again for coming. Thanks for tuning in. And thank you.
Thank you so much, George and Tory. Absolutely wonderful conversation. And apologies, George, for taking 10 years off your career. But, you know, as they say, we like to look on the youthful side of life, right? Anyway, copies of this wonderful essay are available in the foyer downstairs. George is going to sign. I can only suggest, please, this is a great one for the bookshelf, but also for the younger generations to be reading as well, right? We've got to get them onto reading this type of work. Thank you very much, everyone. I know everyone's racing out the door. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you soon at a Hawke Centre event. Thank you.